Hello chess friends and welcome to Inside of Chess channel and welcome to the TCEC Season 19 Cup Finals. So this is now the last stage of this very nice knockout tournament. In the super final we have of course the two top engines Leela C0 and Stockfish NNUE. This is now a really great opportunity for Stockfish NNUE to win both of these tournaments because Stockfish won also the TCEC Season 19, has now really the opportunity to be the undisputed king in chess because the only engine that managed to win both of these tournaments was of course in the previous seasons Leela C0. So today I prepared you the decisive game. I'm not going to reveal you the result. This was, I think, a very intense match game between really the best engines now these days, and let's check out now the game. I think it was a great and instructive French Sicilian with the spinning idea. I think for those who have troubles to play against this opening from whites and for black's perspective, this will be also a very instructive game. So let's check out now the game. As usual in this top engine games, we say round one, and with this Mortal Kombat, this immortal Mortal Kombat sound, fight. So here e4 played by Stockfish NNUE, c5, knight to f3. We have e6, the French variation of the Sicilian, with the setup to break the position immediately with the potential d5 move. We have d4, c takes d4, knight to d4, and now knight to f6. So there is always this problem about the potential e5 move. First of all, white can always get the expansion here on the 5th rank, but the problem is that in some occasions this e5 could be also long-term weakness. Here knight to c3 was played, and we have now bishop to b4. The pinning idea, very aggressive setup here by black. Of course we want to take the e4 pawn, and in the game e5. This is still common theory, and now we have knight to d5. Okay, we have bishop to d2. Played by Stockfish NNUE. There are also some different lines with queen to g4, also very aggressive setup. Bishop to d2, we have knight to c3, b takes c3, and now bishop to f8. Retreating with the bishop, at least black has accomplished a little bit weakened pawn structure here on the c file, the double pawn structure, and also in some occasions this e5 could be a weakness. Although this e5 pawn is our main strength, it could be also the main weakness in the position, because if you have to maybe sometimes support a pawn with f4, then you could face also some dark square problems. For instance, the queen could come to b6, and if you castle, then there is always this tension on dark square. So if you try bishop to e7 here, it's also playable, but then bishop to d3, I think it's very aggressive. After castling, you see we can immediately play h4. And if you try something like maybe d6 to break the position, then queen to h5. I'm just showing you how risky this opening can be. If you play g6, for instance, queen to h6 can be played, and now you cannot even take because you risk an h5 move. This is a very aggressive line. Black is immediately losing. I'm just pointing you out what happens if you, for instance, go after this pawn immediately and castle, because there is always the tension. As I said, the e5 is our main strength, and the pawn on e5 is of course a space advantage, but it's also on the king side. So that's why our attack should be always coordinated to the king side, and see how you can really face some tactical problems immediately if you don't play the opening correctly. So let's go back. So that's why bishop to f8 here, at least get another defender in front of the king. We have bishop to d3, and now knight to a6. Giving up the light for bishop, it's not so good, because you see this knight is out of game. You don't have so many activities to get somehow the knight here on d6. You would love to do that, but now I think black can equalize the position with a very nice move, bishop to b7, and getting use of this long diagonal. Also then afterwards, maybe when we solve the positional problems on the king side by fixing the position, then also this bishop could play much more freely. So that's why taking out the knight is not such a good idea. Knight to c5, and now queen to g4, preventing, and again, this bishop to move. If the bishop moves, of course, we can take the g7 pawn. So h5, kicking away the queen, queen to f3, and now comes rook to b8. We want to, of course, develop our light square bishop. There is, of course, the pin here by the queen on the rook, so that's why rook to b8, a very necessary move. If you try queen to c7 here in order to attack the pawn, then you risk this idea. Knight to b5 is very risky. You see, if you move the queen somewhere, bishop to f4, knight takes d3, maybe can be played, but c takes d3, and you risk maybe this move, knight to d6. It's of course an endgame with, it's a middle game, but this game can transpose very fast into an endgame where we have this opposite colored bishops, but this pawn I think creates really some enormous pressure here on the weak squares here on c7 and e7. So that's why going into this line, I think it's not such a good idea here for black. So that's why after move queen to f3, you see queen to c7, always risking some tempos on the queen. So that's why here a more pragmatic idea by black, playing the move rook to b8, and now finally maybe b6 and bishop to b7. So here h3, we have a6, with also some ideas to expand here on the queen side, and also we're preventing again this move knight to b5. So c4 played by Stockfish NNUE, we have b6 and now queen to g3, again getting the queen on the very annoying file here on the g file, again preventing this bishop to develop. So bishop to b7, we have rook to e1, and now bishop to a8, a very important move to simply get out of the range, and we can now finally create here a b5 pawn breakthrough. This has to be further prepared, but first what we want to do is maybe knight takes d3, c takes d3, and then a b5 pawn breakthrough I think is possible here for black as a counterplay on the queen side, because although the kings are not on opposite side, but I think the main advantage that black has here is of course on the queen side. We have there our attacking possibilities, of course with this direction of the pieces. White should simply make progress on the king side. So rook from a to d1, very nice move. You see Stockfish again builds this Stockfish setup of pieces with these rooks on this semi-open files, centralizing the rooks. The bishops are very active, the knight is centralized, the queen is very active. Again, really something that you have to defend somehow. When Stockfish ever builds this attacking formation, I'm always scared a little bit. I'm not sure what kind of a tactic here Stockfish is preparing. In the game, knight takes d3, getting rid of at least one of these active bishops, and we have now c takes d3. So b5, if you may ask yourself this question, why black this wasn't playing in the game, b5, but then you have a very tricky move here, c5, and if you take for instance the pawn, then again you lose your g7 pawn. So that's why I think this c5 move would really paralyze the whole queen side here, and we can even support it further maybe with knight to b3, and then maybe bishop to a5 ideas, again attacking the queen. So far taking the pawn is not an option, and you see if we get the queen on g7, it's I think a lost game here for black. So that's why you see b5 is not possible immediately. You have to prepare this move further. That gives of course white some extra time, some extra tempos in order to make progress on the king side. Here g6, and now comes rook to b1, preventing finally this idea of b5. So here Stockfish plays really a nice positional game, nice prophylactic idea. Rook to b1, never allow really black to expand on the queen side. Bishop to e7, a4, again with the same idea, blocking simply the queen side, castling, and now rook to b2. Now Stockfish wants of course to change the direction a little bit of attack, because we have now a weak pawn, a clear target in black's position. It's a weak pawn on b6. So bishop to c6, bishop to h6, attacking the rook, and here rook to e8, and now rook from e to b1, simply attacking further the weakness, and now queen to c7. Bishop to a4. Bishop to a4 can I think be met with a very aggressive move, knight to f3, because the bishop is not here anymore on this diagonal, where it protects of course here on the square f3. If you take for instance bishop takes a4, I think knight to f3 followed with bishop to g5, and simply getting rid of the key defender of dark squares, the dark square bishop, is I think a very nice idea. So the queen is a little bit also overloaded to the defense of the b6, so I think going into this line is perfectly fine with bishop to g5. And as I said, the bishop still has to stay here, the bishop still has to protect the potential move knight to f3. So that's why queen to c7 first. We have again this very nice idea, getting rid of the key defender of dark squares. It's of course dark square bishop with the bishop to g5, and now after bishop to g5, queen to g5. This is simply this new Stockfish style, going positionally into games. Great move, and I hope you realize that black has really here some weaknesses: d6 weakness, f6 weakness, h6, g7. All of the dark squares in front of the king are really clear targets. What we want to do, so far it's not possible, but if we manage to cement our knight on one of these squares, on f6 or maybe on d6, this, from a strategical point of view, it's a completely lost game here for black. Although black has an active bishop, but I think it's much harder here for black to activate some other pieces in the attack. Here, if we cement the knight on f6, then the whole game will be simply built around this very nice outposted and centralized knight, and I think this knight is much better than the bishop. So bishop to a4, finally taking a pawn, but it's not a problem. We're giving up some material, but it's for the initiative. It's a nice compensation, I think, because again, Stockfish has the open files, the open A and B file, also this very nice centralized knight. Rook to a2, queen to c5, attacking the knight, and now queen to e3. Hanging on to our main advantage, it's not a problem. Still, this pawn is advanced. The queen is protecting everything. What we don't want to do in these positions is to trade off the queens immediately. If we find the path maybe of the knight here on f6 on d6, then maybe we could go and simplify the position by trading off the queens. But so far, we want to exploit the dark square weaknesses. b5, rook to c1, getting the rook, of course, on the same file like the queen, because there is now the tension on the c file. We have rook to c8 and now rook to a1. Now the serious threat is, of course, c takes b5 with the discovered attack on the queen. Queen to f8, retreating with the queen, and now king to h2. Improving the position of the king is also a nice idea. The king is perfectly fine here. You cannot take so far the pawn. Of course, your bishop is hanging. That's always a nice tactical threat here. d6, finally breaking the space advantage of white. Very important move now to simplify the position. The evaluation is still about equal, maybe white slightly better, so this is playable for both sides because black has, of course, this extra pawn, but you have to make something happen. If this game goes into an endgame with one pawn up, it's of course then suddenly a winning game for black. So that's why you have to make something out of it, out of this gambit line in which you give up basically a pawn. So f4, supporting, of course, our e5 advantage. That's our main space advantage, so we have to hang on to that. Rook from e to d8, and now knight to f3. Regrouping, removing the knight. Now I think the clear path of the knight is knight to g5, knight to e4, and then knight to f6 or knight to d6. So d5, we have this idea, knight to g5, d takes c4, and we have now again d takes c4. Again, you cannot take rook takes c4, rook takes c4, b takes c4, rook takes a4. So it's not possible so far. So that's why queen to b4, and now comes a very aggressive move, f5 by Stockfish NNUE. I'm not sure how many of us would play this move. Simply great pawn breakthrough motif. Let's see possible continuations. If you try something like g takes f5, then queen to g3 will happen. There is, of course, this tactical threat on the g file. You have to move the king somewhere, and after knight to h7, you see queen to g5. Now knight to f6 is simply winning here for white. So if you try, for instance, e takes f5 here in this position, not to take with the pawn, g pawn, then queen to a7, very tricky move. If you protect, for instance, the pawn on f7, then e6 immediately, I think, breaks the position. After maybe something like queen to d6, king to h1, and now you could try maybe something like rook to c7, but here Stockfish prepared really a nice tactical shot. It's e takes f7. You could maybe take with the rook, but now knight to f7, and you see now if you take, for instance, here the queen, we can also take out this queen, and it's game over. If you, for instance, here after rook to knight takes f7, rook to f7, okay, this is now maybe playable for black because there are, of course, some extra pawns, but you're down the exchange, and I think there is a cool way here to activate our rooks. We can simply get use of the e file. Still, there is this tension. You cannot again take this pawn because your bishop is hanging. The bishop is a little bit out of game in this particular line, so I think white will find a way to activate this rooks, and this is now, I think, completely winning again for white. So that's why f5, really a nice tactical shot here, nice pawn breakthrough motif, which creates again really some madness in front of black's king. Here queen to d2, trying to force the trades of queens, and here Stockfish finally accepts the challenge because this is now our advanced pawn. We can also move it to f6, where it of course creates another space advantage. Then the king is a little bit locked here around his own pawn, so the king could be endangered afterwards. After queen to d2, we have rook to d2, and now comes this idea, f6. You could also try maybe something like c takes b5. This is also a very interesting line because you're basically forced now to trade off the rooks, rook to c1, and maybe after something like finally g takes f5, you see we can get use of this pass pawn. and if you try to protect it, then maybe attack the bishop, and here simply moving further. And now the king can be very active. We can use the king here on h4. Again, try maybe to find even better squares for the knight. As I said, if we manage to get this knight to f6, it's game over for black. So f6 here, very interesting line in the game. Rook to c6 was played. Here rook from a to b1, we have rook to c7, rook to d1, and now rook to c8. You have to protect, of course, your back rank. This is not an option here for black, so that's why, again, rook to d7, attacking the weak pawn on f7, so that's why rook to f8. C takes b5, we have a takes b5, and now rook to a7, and now rook to c4. Maybe not the most of accurate moves here. The Stockfish engine of mine suggests to move rook to c5 in order to attack finally this very important pawn in white's position. It's the pawn on e5, but still it's a very annoying position after the move h4. H4 is very interesting line, because if you try, for instance, to take rook takes c5, rook takes e5, then you get rook to c1, and you cannot protect anymore the 7th rank. You would be probably forced to give up maybe your rook for the knight, and then again white goes into an endgame with up the exchange. For instance, if you try rook to f5, then we can take. That's also a nice tactical shot. Knight to f7. For instance, rook to f7 is not a possibility, because you get rook to c8, and you see this very important pawn that we have advanced. You cannot protect anymore the rook, so that's why a very tricky line. So rook to f5 is not a possibility. If you go somewhere else, you see, then we're building this very nice battery on the f file, and you lose simply your very important f7 pawn. So very nice tactical preparations here by Stockfish. Without many pieces on the board, we have to realize that, because more tactics are of course possible when more pieces on the board, but here are basically 2 rooks and 1 knight, this very advanced pawn, and they are so great, so many great tactical shots. So as I said, here rook to f5 simply not possible. Knight to f7 with potential knight to h6 moves. Again, the whole position is falling apart. So rook to c4, 5, as I said, maybe h4, maybe rook to c4 then, but now king to g2, king to g1 is maybe an option, maybe something like rook to c1, but again, a very interesting idea happens if after move rook to b7, again, you were forced, maybe you can again try back. You can never really leave the protection of this c file. Then again, we're building this rook battery on the 7th rank. So very tricky endgame here. After the move rook to a7, here rook to c4 was played, so not this move rook to c5, but now rook to a1. We're playing now sort of a Zugzwang motif. We want this rook to move somewhere finally, and then get use of the c file. So in the game, finally, it's move rook to c5. We have again the similar idea, h4. You saw the tactical problems. If you try rook takes e4, then we can again play rook to c1. That's not possible, so that's why rook to c4. Now again, a similar idea like we analyzed so far. King to g1, rook to c5 again, rook to b7, playing really this now Zugzwang motif. Rook to e7, and now rook to c5. We have rook to a3. This is now Stockfish idea too, because we couldn't get use of the d file. The bishop is covering that square, so we want to play now rook to a3, rook to d3, and then get use of the d file, and finally connect the rooks on the 7th rank. So that's why rook to a3. We have rook to c8, king to f2, and now rook to c2, attacking the king, and now knight to e4. Very nice maneuver of the knight. Here I think the knight is even much more powerful. Again, we have some tactical shots possible. You saw the possible tactical shots on f7, but now this knight can really get even a better square. It's of course a square d6. In the game, rook to a8, rook to c3 finally comes, and now rook takes e8. We have rook takes e8 again, knight to d6. We have finally rook to c7, and now b4, and now rook to b7, attacking here the pawn. Here g5 was played. If you try here b3, then king to f2 can be played. You're again in sort of a Zugzwang idea. You cannot play with the bishop. Really nice immortal Zugzwang played by Stockfish. If you move the rook, then you simply lose your pawn. If you move the bishop, then again you lose the pawn. If you move the pawn, of course, then it's again the loss. So you would be forced to play something like g5, but I think here again knight to f7 is simply winning the game. You lost your very important important pawn. This is now a supported pass pawn, simply game over. So really nice positional game here by Stockfish NNUE. Rook to b7, we have g5, h takes g5, and now bishop to c2, trying to finally improve the position of the bishop. We have rook takes b4, rook to a8, and now rook to b7, again attacking the pawn. Here bishop to g6, and pause the video and try to find now the winning sequence here for white. As usual, we say, let's give that again a new Mortal Kombat sound. So test your might in chess. Try now to find the best next move. It's really a nice tactic that Stockfish, of course, saw. Maybe not so easy to see because it seems so that everything is well protected here. But the problem is now this move, knight takes f7. In the game, rook to a3 was played. It's losing game again by black. But if you try bishop to f7, then we have g6. That's the main problem. And now rook to g7, we can get the bishop back. We will eventually take out this pawn, and we're going then into an endgame where we have 3 versus 1 pawns, and in the potential rook endgame, this is simply winning. This is a really nice tactical shot by Stockfish. Knight to f7, rook to a3, king to f4. A couple of checks were played. Again, a similar idea. g6, again with the same problems. Rook to g7. Again, we're taking this pawn. We can take out now this pawn. Okay, here after rook to g3 and rook takes g2 and rook to h4, we have now the problems. We can take out also this pawn. In the game, king to f7 was played, but not a problem because we can create now this check. If you go behind, that's not possible because we'll simply play f7. If you go here rook to c8, then rook to g8 wins, of course, the game. You cannot take in. We promote simply to queen here. So that's really this power of the connected of this supported pass pawn. Whenever you accomplish to do that in potential rook end games, it's of course perfectly fine. Now after king to g6, we have now rook to g7. In the game, king to h6 was played, but now we're cutting off this very important file for the king. The king is now out of game, and now our king can play much more freely. We're going after this pawn, and the rook has to be also careful because there is always this threat f7 followed with f8, so that's why rook to c3, a couple more checks, but now comes this idea f7, and in this position Leela c0 resigned after the move rook to f2. So as I said, possible continuation, we can simply promote, and it's game over. So incredible game by Stockfish NNUE with great positional preparations, with great tactics, with great opening strategies. Really incredible engine. This is, you saw, I think it wasn't maybe the most tactical of Stockfish games, but it was really incredible one in this French Sicilian with this advanced pawn, supporting the advanced pawn. First, this prophylactic idea of never allow black to make progress. And I've been asked now by one of my viewers to maybe make sort of a recap of the game, maybe in 1 minute. So let's go back. Let's see now the most important strategical elements. So here I'm going through that again. So space advantage, e5 move. I think I could do that in the future if you maybe agree with that. So we'll give that really a fast run here. Knight to d5. So okay, we're taking away the bishop, and now really this bishop pair first with the support of the e5. So we're simply getting the queen into the game, and now this prophylactic idea, very important too after trades of pieces here. I think this was very important, a4, and now this move I really like, this positional trades of pieces. So bishop to g5, because there are obvious dark square weaknesses in front of the king, so getting rid of the key defender of dark square. So we're going now into positional trades of pieces, although you're down a pawn, but you saw how Stockfish NNUE exploited these weaknesses, supporting again, very important move. I think also f4, supporting the e5, and now getting use simply of the dark square weaknesses. f5, really brutal move, and now f6, locking really the king. And let's go back to this monster tactic. So okay, here finally rook to a3. I think this was a very important moment to threaten this connection of rooks on the 7th rank. And now after rook to c8, here knight to d6, and now rook to c7, and now Zugzwang motif, very nice endgame technique, really forcing now finally black to do make a move, and here knight takes f7, the great tactical shot, and it was game over. So incredible game again. Again, Stockfish won another tournament, so Stockfish is now the winner of the TCEC season 19 and also of the 7th Cup final. Great congratulations to the developers. They're really doing a great job, and we'll see now what will happen also with the new version of Komodo NNUE. I've been told that the new version of Komodo hasn't played in this TCEC Cup finals. It was the normal version of Komodo NNUE, but on chess.com we're following also this computer chess championship in which Komodo NNUE is performing and plays really great chess. So in the future I think we'll have Leela C0, Stockfish NNUE and Komodo NNUE, I think, battling always for the throne. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. Great French Sicilian. If you want to see more positional and brutal tactical games like this, check out my commented chess games played by computers. Here's the link. And if you want to see maybe the best chess games by humans, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and what to say, chess is the best, of course.